I'm having a lot of conversations with folks inside the academy, outside of it, online, in person, on both sides of the Atlantic, as I'm in the home stretch of the final book manuscript. And increasingly, I'm talking about violence. And in particular, I'm being pressed by academics who argue for objective distance from questions about things like, in particular, John Brown and the people who enabled him, and their acceptance of violence as necessary. And the vibe has been that being above moral stakes produces better history. It doesn't, folks. It produces worse history. History that can't explain what mattered to the people who lived it and how that can matter to you. Hey folks, I'm Tad Sturmer. I'm an American scholar of resistance history and the American Revolution at the University of Southern Denmark and the author of A Resistance History of the United States. Let's talk about the notional James Madison, or even particular James Madison fan club, and how ivory towers keep some people from seeing what's on the ground. What do I mean by the James Madison fan club? Madison spoke for many, for his establishment, when he said in the Virginia Ratifying Convention to approve the Constitution, against those who wanted slavery addressed by that Constitution, that preserving the Union was of greater value than ending slavery. And then some people realized that choice, union over justice, really wasn't worth it. They rejected the nationalist fiction, and then they did something about it. You don't want to draw a straight line from Harper's Ferry to Fort Sumter? Think that's reductive? Fine, you do you. But you sure as hell need to draw a line from Harper's Ferry to the 13th Amendment. And one of my favorite historians, E.P. Thompson, who I think about a lot in terms of this stuff, he understood the problems that some academics run into. When Marxist historians try to read 18th century food riots as proto-proletarian class consciousness, Thompson, the author of The Making of the English Working Class, the foundational text of that kind of study, pushed back. I'm not a Marxist, but I'm Thompson's kind of historian. He pushed back and he wrote this book, Customs in Common, which people who are interested in this kind of thing, if you're interested in the making of the English working class, you gotta read this too. And he pushed back not because class analysis is wrong, but because people imposing it on those who didn't think in those terms distorts what actually happened in the past. You have to understand the moral economy that food rioters actually operated within, the legitimacy claims they actually made, the world as they experienced it. That point is the heart of my approach to history. Go to where they are, understand things on their terms, in the moment, in their moment, but also, as good public history, do the hard work to identify how that relates to today, in your terms, in your moment. That's what public historians do. Now here's the thing those academics demanding objective distance don't get. Everyone views from somewhere. They claim to view history from nowhere in particular, pure objectivity, neutral ground. But they're viewing from inside institutions that benefit from not questioning state legitimacy and careers that depend on it. That's a position. That's choice. Calling it objectivity doesn't make it neutral. It makes it unexamined. Resistance history names its position up front, centering people who challenge power, recovering voices that nationalist historiography excludes. That makes it more empirical, not less. The position is explicit. The sources can be tested. The claims can be challenged. That's what rigor looks like. Not pretending you're above the moral stakes, but acknowledging where you stand and showing your evidence. Same with slavery and resistance, and those questions of preserving the Union, maintaining the stability of the comfortable. When historians demand objective distance from the question of whether slavery justified violent resistance, they're not being rigorous. They're imposing a framework that the historical actors themselves rejected, from black loyalists to the secret six. That framework is liberal nationalism's assumption that state legitimacy, which is really just the comfort of the already comfortable, trumps all other claims. Enslaved people didn't think chattel bondage was an unfortunate institution requiring patient reform. Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman didn't think their former owners' property rights deserved any respect. Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner didn't think Confederate traders deserved their plantations or their seats in Congress back. These weren't failures of objectivity. These were moral judgments based on lived experience of how power operated and would operate if given the chance. Treating those judgments as something historians should be above isn't objectivity. It's refusing to engage with what made history matter, its consequences in the moment. It's flattening the moral stakes that drove people to act, to resist, to fight, to die, to kill. You can understand why 700,000 Americans died in the Civil War if you maintain objective distance from whether slavery was worth fighting to end, and don't take a stand on that in front of your students, in front of your peers, in front of everybody. You can't understand Reconstruction if you treat constitutional process and racial terrorism as morally equivalent concerns. You can't understand resistance if you accept the state's framework, enforced by a conservative American political culture, that resistance is inherently illegitimate because it might threaten the comfort of the establishment. In 1850, that meant being fine with the oppression of 4 million Americans. Let's work to reform. Gradual approaches are all that's needed. And today, the scope of oppression is expanding once again. Are you more concerned about the destruction of the East Wing, oh horror, or American citizens being brutalized by ICE every day on our own streets, on food being denied to the 1 of every 8 Americans who rely on SNAP? 1 of every 8. This isn't about imposing present politics on the past. I don't do that. It's about taking seriously the moral questions that past actors considered urgent and relating them to today. That's not reducing historical complexity, I don't think. It's recovering it. It's taking seriously the moral questions that past actors considered urgent, that mattered in their lives. History becomes usable not by avoiding moral questions, but by engaging them honestly, showing how people confronted impossible choices, what they decided, what happened as a result, because there are always consequences, and what we can learn about how power operates and how resistance functions. And that requires judgment. It requires taking sides on whether slavery was evil, whether the Constitution protected it, whether resistance was justified. Not because those judgments are politically convenient, but because refusing to make them produces history that can't account for its own subject matter. Slavery was evil. The Constitution was pro-slavery. It protected it. Resistance was justified. Those are not political claims. They're historical ones, based on evidence. What chattel slavery, treating people as property, actually was, what the Constitution actually said, what alternatives actually existed. The claim to objectivity that some academics make is actually ideology. It's liberal nationalism's assumption that American institutions deserve respect, legitimacy, regardless of what they do, how they operate. That assumption, baked into our political culture, enforced by the storytellers and media makers around it, leaves certain questions unaskable, certain sources inadmissible, certain conclusions unthinkable. Resistance history asks those questions, admits those sources, reaches those conclusions, and not because it's more political, because it's more empirical. It follows the evidence even when the evidence indicts the state, makes uncomfortable the comfortable. Because it all makes people uncomfortable. It's tough history, especially people comfortable within the institutions that descended from the ones that enforced slavery, crushed Reconstruction, enabled Jim Crow. They prefer history that doesn't threaten institutional legitimacy. They call that objectivity. It's not. It's protection. And it produces bad history. And we're here to take a swipe at that, wherever it is.